So the purpose of this part of the chapter is looking for the zeros of a quadratic. And so yesterday we looked at how factored form can give us the zeros. And what I mean by that is if we have some kind of quadratic, so I'll draw this in, the zeros are where it crosses the x-axis. So that's our goal. Where can we figure out where it crosses the x-axis? And we looked at factored form and how that helps us. So to review from yesterday, what are the zeros or the x-intercepts of the following functions? So if we have x squared plus 4x minus 5, if we factor that, so you can use a box and circle or other methods, but if we factor that, we will get x, this will be plus 5, and x minus 1. So again, you factor it, box and circle, or another method, and these are the two factors of x squared plus 4x minus 5. And so we looked at, all right, finding zeros. We can set each one equal to 0 and solve. So we want to know what makes x plus 5 equals 0 and what makes x minus 1 equals 0. So this is called zero product property, which is 0 times anything is 0. So if either one of these is 0, the whole thing is 0. So you set equal to 0, we solve. So we'll subtract 5 from each side. So here, if x is negative 5, that factor is 0. Here we'll add 1 to each side. If x is 1, then that is 0. So the two zeros of this quadratic are negative 5 and 1. Now if we were to graph that, what that means is that it would cross at negative 5, and we'd have another 0 that would cross at 1. So that's what we're trying to find. Where do these quadratics cross the x-axis? All right, let's take a look at the next one, and I think I just made a typo here. I wanted this one to be x squared minus 49, but I think my equation editor did something wrong. So this is difference of squares, and if you remember when you factor this, so this will be x plus 7, x minus 7, and we want to know what makes that equal 0. So again, we split it up. What makes this first one 0? Well, that would be negative 7. How about this one? Well, if x is 7, this is 0. So again, if we were to graph that, what that would mean is it would cross at, I didn't draw my graph to scale here, but that would cross at negative 7, and it would cross at 7. So we're trying to find the zeros or the x-intercepts of the graph. And if you have the factors, it's just what makes each factor 0. All right, let's try the next one. And again, if one of these is 0, then the whole thing is 0. It doesn't matter which one. So you're going to take each factor and set it equal to 0. The 2 doesn't matter right here. We just want to know what makes x plus 7 equals 0 and what makes 3x minus 4 equals 0. So for this first one, we know that here if x is negative 7, the whole thing will be 0, because if this is 0, the whole thing is 0. All right, let's try the next one. We solve this. We'll add 4 to each side. So you get 3x equals 4. We'll divide by 3. And so the other 0 would be at 4/3, which is 1.3 repeating. So again, if you were to graph this, one would be at negative 7, and one would be at 4/3. We're finding the zeros. Okay, and our last one, again, we'd need a box and circle to do this. So let's do our box and circle. All right, so with your box and circle, we want to figure out what multiplies to negative 24x squared that adds to our middle circle 10x. So what are some factors at 24? Well, that would be 4 and 6. But would that add to a 10 if we make one negative? No, it won't. All right, how about 12 and 2? And this one will work if we make the 2 negative. So here we have negative 2x, and we have 12x. All right, so when we factor, we know that the outside box will be x and x. We have to put a 3 somewhere, and in this case, the way I set up 3 makes more sense on the top, because 3 times 4 would give us 12x, and then x minus 2 would give us negative 2x. All right, so this one right here, I'm going to erase some of this. So our factors are 3x minus 2 and x plus 4. Okay. Let's erase this right here. And we know one of the zeros just by looking. So right here, x would be negative 4. And that would make this one 0. So negative 4 would make that 0. How about this guy? So we have 3x minus 2 equals 0. We are going to add 2 to each side. So you have 3x equals 2, and then divide each side by 3, so x is 2/3. So this one would cross twice. One would be at -4, and one would be at 2/3. So that's finding zeros. Okay, so again, steps are you factor, and what makes each factor 0? Those are your zeros. All right, but today we're going to look at another way to find the x-intercepts or 0. So this is helpful if you don't like factoring, which some people don't like, but also what happens if you can't factor. So look at this one. Find the zeros of x squared plus 5x plus 3. If we were to try this in a box and circle, we would have x squared, we would have 5x and 3. We would want to know what multiplies to 3x squared that adds to 5x. All right, so factors of 3, well, 3 is prime. So the only factors of 3 would be 1 and 3, or -1 and -3. And no combination of 1 and 3 will give us a 5. So this one is not factorable, which means that we won't have like whole number zeros here. All right, so another way to find the zeros is called quadratic formula. And it's this: to find your zeros, x equals opposite b. So the negative is opposite b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So it looks long and hard, but it's not. So we can use this for any quadratic equation in standard form. So standard form is when you have the highest power first. So you have ax squared, where a is a number, plus b, which b is a number, bx plus c. So this is called standard form. All right, so here are the steps for using quadratic formula. Oh, and there's a song to help you remember how to put it in. So I'll show the video in class, but there's a bunch of them. But the one to Pop Goes the Weasel is the one we watch in class.
Above the world so high,
Not this.
like a diamond in the sky. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are.
All right, so she's going to sing the next part.
Good job, Emily. What about the x equals?
X equals -b.
Uh-huh.
X equals -b plus or minus the square root, b squared minus 4ac, all over 2.
So to Pop Goes the Weasel, if that helps you remember it, you can sing it to Pop Goes the Weasel to help you remember the formula. All right, so here's what quadratic formula, here's how you use it to find the zeros of the graph if you don't like factoring or if you can't factor. So step 1, make sure the equation is in standard form. What standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c, where it's the highest power of x first and then on down, and if that equals 0. Okay. So identify a, b, and c, plug into quadratic formula. I want you to simplify it by putting it into 3 separate chunks, and then you'll find the solution. So we'll do these 5 steps several times. All right, so first step, it's in standard form already. So we're going to find a, b, and c. A is the number next to the x squared. So if there's not a number next to the x squared, it's a 1. B is the number next to the x. Here's 5. C is the number by itself. So here's 3. All right, so now we plug into the formula. So it's x equals, she said -b, but it's going to be the opposite of b. So the opposite of 5 is -5. So x equals opposite b plus or minus the square root of b squared, so 5 squared, minus 4ac, so 4 times 1 times 3, all over 2a. All right, now there's a lot of ways that you could try to type this into your calculator, and it might make a mistake if it doesn't do the right order of operations. So when you show work for me, I want you to separate it into 3 parts. So we have our first number. I want you to figure out this number under the square root sign. It's called the discriminant, and I want you to figure out the bottom. All right, so when we do that, here's what it will look like. So we'll get -5. Plus or minus the square root, and then you can type that part into your calculator, the 5 squared minus 4 times 1 times 3, which is 25 minus 12. But if you just want to type it in, here's what it looks like. 5 squared minus 4 times 1 times 3. Okay, so I want that separately. It's 13. It's 25 minus 12, which is 13. So I want that separate here. Here's different colors. So we'd have the square root is there of 13 over the bottom number, and 2 times 1 is 2. So I do want to see this work, so I can say, all right, they knew how to simplify. And then you can type it into your calculator. And then there's 2 answers. So when you type this in, one is negative 5 plus the square root of 13, hit enter, divide by 2, and one is negative 5 minus the square root of 13, hit enter, and divide by 2. So then you can type it in. You wouldn't have to show that step I just wrote out, just the one before it. All right, so we have negative 5 plus the square root of 13, hit enter, divide by 2. So one of our zeros is at negative 0.697. I'll round that to negative 0.7. And then I should say x equals, okay. And then the other one, when we type it in, it will be negative 5 minus the square root of 13. Hit enter, and then divide by 2. So negative 4.3 if I round. So x equals negative 4.3. Okay, so what does that mean? It means we have two zeros here. And so if I were to graph a quadratic, all right, here's what it would look like. Here's your quadratic. And then we would graph it. And so one of our answers would be negative 0.7, and the other would be, oh, they're both negative, so I drew my picture wrong. Try again. All right, so again, here it is. They're both negative. So one would be at negative 4.3, and then the other, negative 4.3. The other zero would be at negative 0.7. So again, what we're looking for is where does it cross the x-axis. Okay, next example. First step, get it in standard form. This one's not. So we have to add 7 to each side to get everything on one side. So it's 3x squared plus 10x plus 7. We want to know when that equals 0. So now we can find a, b, and c. So here a is 3, b is 10, c is 7. All right, so remember the song, x equals opposite b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So here's what it looks like. I want you to figure out these three parts separately. So you have the negative 10, you have this thing under the radical called the discriminant, and you have this number on the bottom. All right, so we get negative 10 plus or minus the square root. You can type that part into your calculator, 10 squared, which is 100, minus 4 times 3 times 7. All right, and you're going to get 16. Okay, so this one, we could have used a box and circle, but that's the square root of 16 all over 2a. 2 times 3 is 6. And again, from there, you can type it in. You can do negative 10 plus the square root of 16, or 4, divided by 6, and negative 10 minus the square root of 16, divided by 6, and get your two answers. So again, the two places that it crosses. So we have negative 10 plus the square root of 16, or I could have put 4. Hit enter, divide by 2. So negative 3 is one of our zeros, and then negative 10 minus the square root of 16, or 4, divided by, oh, it's divided by 6. I divided by 2, so I have to redo that one, sorry. So divided by 6. Okay, so one of our answers is negative 2.3 repeating. Let's do the first one. I did it wrong. So negative 10 plus the square root of 16, I'll put 4, divided by 6. All right, so negative 1. So our two zeros are negative 2.3 and negative 1. So let's write that down. Okay, so two answers. X equals negative 1, and here x equals negative 2.3 repeating. And again, what this means is if we were to graph this, it would cross two places, and one would be at negative 1, and one would be at negative 2.3 repeating. Okay, so it would cross two different places. Okay, let's try this 2 more times, and then that's all we're going to practice today is quadratic formula. Your assignment will be the same. Okay, so the next one, x equals opposite b. Oh, first we have to find a, b, and c. So first up, a, b, and c. A is the number next to the x squared, here it's 1. B is the number next to the x, here it's 5. C is the number by itself, here it's 6. So x equals opposite b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, so again, I want you to separate these three parts and figure that out. If we do that, we get negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 5 squared is 25. 25 minus 24 is 1 over 2. And so now we can split it up. And I know the square root of 1 is 1. So we have negative 5 plus 1 over 2 and negative 5 minus 1 over 2. So this answer, negative 5 plus 1 is negative 4. Negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2. And then right here, negative 5 minus 1 is negative 6. Divided by 2 is negative 3. So this one we could have done box and circle because they're whole numbers, but quadratic formula gives the zeros. And so here we have two zeros at negative 3 and at negative 2 is where they cross. Okay, 2 more examples, and then work time. So here it is. Identify A, B, and C. Plug into your formula. X equals opposite b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. So we get x equals negative 2 plus or minus. We get this part right here. 2 squared is 4. 4 minus 4 is 0 over 2. And in this case, we have negative 2 plus or minus 0, which is the same thing. So I'm just going to take that off. So here, it's just negative 2 divided by 2, which is negative 1. So if we were to graph this, we would see that at negative 1, it's the only place that it crosses. So if you have that square root of 0, you only get one answer, and it crosses at that one spot. All right, and then we'll take a look at our last example. Get it in standard form. So we have x squared minus 2x. And here you have the minus 2. I'm going to add 2 to each side so that we have 0 on one side. Okay, so I added 2 to each side. Let's find A, B, and C. A is 1, B is negative 2, C is 2. Plug into your formula. X equals opposite B, so 2, plus or minus the square root. And here if B is negative, you have to put it in parentheses. So negative 2 squared minus 4 times 1 times 2. All over 2 times 1. All right, so you plug in. Let's find each chunk here. So we have x equals 2 plus or minus the square root. This is 4 minus 8, so negative 4 all over 2. And here we have to stop because if you notice, we can't take the square root of negative 4. It's nothing multiplied by itself is a negative number. So here, if you have this negative, we're going to say there's no real solution. And we'll take a look later on this week at what to do if you have that negative. Okay, so if you get a negative underneath the radical, not a real solution. All right, so there's quadratic formula.